G'day, Ziggy D here. Let's take a look at some excellent masteries and passives that you may have missed in the new passive tree. Some of these are little hidden tricks that you can use to improve your build or solve a problem, and others are just less obvious good stuff in general. On the left, we have this little regeneration hearty cluster. This hearty thing in particular has 15% increased life regeneration rate. This is very significant for any regen stacking builds, which has been enhanced quite a bit on the left side of the tree, in particular the bottom left side of the tree. And if you're playing something like a Chieftain or Inquisitor, this is huge scaling for your regeneration. For example, this one node takes my life regen from 406 to 568. Not bad, and I have reduced life regeneration from one of the life masteries as well. The only downside for this cluster is that it is indeed a life mastery, and there is a limited number of good masteries on that particular mastery tree. By comparison, Juggernaut, the classic, hasn't really changed. It's an armor life cluster, and most people take it because it's a life cluster. However, unlike most of the life clusters, this one is actually an armor mastery, which gives you some different options compared to all of those life clusters that you're taking, which you've probably maxed out the masteries on. In particular here, I quite like that you take 30% reduced extra damage from critical strikes. For this next one, I just wanted to call some attention to one of the new keystones, Divine Shield, which I haven't really seen people talking about much because it is quite good. It has a drawback that's not really a drawback in most builds that will take it. It says cannot recover energy shield to above armor, so that means you cannot recover your energy shield amount to above your armor amount. On most hybrid armor ES builds, you'll have way more armor than you have energy shield, so that drawback is rarely ever an issue. And what it actually does is it does 3% of your physical damage prevented from hits is regenerated as energy shield per second. Now compare this to something like energy shield regen. That is based on your maximum energy shield, so you need a big pool for energy shield regen to have much of an impact, unless of course you're an Inquisitor, which kind of circumvents that whole mechanic. In this case though, Divine Shield, the regen is based on the physical damage prevented, and it doesn't care about your maximum energy shield. The net result of this is that even a small amount of energy shield becomes a very significant defensive layer for both preventing damage and avoiding stuns with this mechanic, as long as you have some armor. The more damage you take, the more energy shield you regen, and it can be quite impactful. It's also quite well positioned, and often only 1 point to take, so well worth considering if you're a hybrid armor ES build anywhere in this vicinity. Next up, definitely don't sleep on Prismatic Skin and its cluster for all of these maximum resistance increases. These were added to help armor builds shore up something they're not good against, which is elemental damage. 1 or 2% might not seem like very much if you're unfamiliar, but taking yourself from 75% to 76% and so on is a huge extra step in your mitigation against elemental damage. It's impactful enough that if you already pass through here, you're pretty crazy to not take it. It's also got a pretty nice mastery tree with things like corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you as an option. Any of these Warcry clusters, you can see them here, have the mastery tree. And the one right at the very bottom is Warcries have a minimum of 10 power. This brings back a mechanic that we used to have, but that was removed from the game, which allows Enduring Cry to give you a guaranteed endurance charge every time you use it, even when there's no monsters around. So you can take that and you can get that effect back again and have a way to generate charges before going into an encounter or between packs. The axe masteries in general are really good, so definitely take that into consideration when you're choosing a weapon, but the enemies you hit on destroy don't kill is the one I wanted to draw attention to. It allows you to circumvent a lot of mechanics that kill you in Path of Exile, things like porcupines shooting out their spines, and things like Detonate Dead can't trouble you if there are no corpses. It may seem a little odd that porcupines don't shoot out their spines if you destroy their corpses, but effectively that's a still on death effect that is circumvented by this mechanic. Marked for Death down here at the bottom of the tree next to Point Blank gives you Culling Strike against marked enemies, things like Assassin's Mark and Poacher's Mark, which are quite good single target curses. The Mastery also has a very nice effect in it as well, which gives you Life Flask gain a charge when you hit your marked enemy no more than once every 0.5 seconds, so twice a second effectively on fast attacking builds. This is extremely good if you're doing a lot of boss fighting. It'll allow you to get and maintain your life flasks throughout the entirety of the fight. Very good stuff and super worth considering for 4 points if you're in this area. Now here's some awesome super secret tech. If you're playing literally any poison build, positioned very nicely is this claw cluster here. Now, you might not be playing claws, but that doesn't matter because this is a good cluster regardless. It's got chance to poison on hit, increase poison duration, which is DPS for poison builds, And then actual damage over time multiply for poison that doesn't care about you using a claw. But most importantly, the mastery is insanely good. You can get 10 life and 5 mana gained on hit with your attacks. So as long as you're using any attack, and this counts for the new poisonous concoction. And this one mastery will solve your mana problems in many cases, especially with multi-hitting builds that use GMP or volley. 5 mana gain per hit multiplied by the amount of hits you're putting out is a lot of mana gained back. So this one, in addition to boosting your poison damage, can solve your mana problems without having to take any sort of leech or anything like that, which can be pretty ineffective in poison builds. And I actually wanted to mention that the attack damage, leeches life and mana there, is not as an attractive option as it may look, because often most poison builds aren't actually dealing much hit damage. But that's not all. The mastery also has a fantastic second option if you don't have any mana problems or don't really care about the life gain on hit. Enemies poisoned by you cannot deal critical strikes. Complete crit immunity as long as you poison enemies. And if you're playing like a Pathfinder, you're proliferating poisons like crazy, and none of them will be able to crit you. So this basically wipes crits off of the table, which are the things that often kill you or one-shot you in Path of Exile. So this Claw Mastery is insanely good, and this cluster is extremely well positioned as well. It's right in here where most poison builds are going to travel, because there's poison nodes all around here. As you can see, there's a poison cluster right here. Travel down and come and get it over here. So you basically have to go past it. And there's one over here, and both of these clusters are also really good as well. So most of the time you're going to be pathing right past this. So definitely consider it in your poison build if you aren't already using it. On a similar note, you've got up here a bow cluster, Hunter's Gambit, that is potentially good for non-bow builds. Now, while you do have to take an increased damage over time for bow skills, no, that doesn't do anything. And this is a little bit more point heavy than the claw one, so definitely not as good as that. It does have damage over time multiplier for poisons here and here, chance to poison on hit with attacks, which is generic, chaos damage over time multiplier, and skill effect duration, all very good stuff. And inside the masteries is 20% chance to gain phasing on kill, the second one from the bottom there, with 8% increased movement speed while phasing. Quite a good little mastery effect as well. And again, that's not bow specific, so will work for any build. So something worth considering. A bit more point heavy than the other, not as powerful, but still quite good. Any crit-focused clusters, like Heartseeker down here in the range area, have access to +3 level of all critical support gems. This isn't super impactful in the early game, just boosting your increased critical strikes gem isn't going to do much, but this can be pretty impactful later on when you get to Awakened gems. In particular, Awakened Cast on Crit is going to benefit a lot from that, because I believe it also gets cooldown recovery as well, or its recovery effect, which can help you reach a new breakpoint. So worth considering for any critical builds. You're probably already taking these clusters anyway. Back here by the poison stuff is Field Medicine, a cluster that I really like that I think a lot of people will just completely ignore, because unless they're playing a Pathfinder, they might think, Flasks, why do I want Flasks? This is pretty good for any build, really. For 2 points, if you're coming down here or through here, which is a common pathing routes, you've got some life flask scaling that is quite impactful. You've got Life Flask gain a charge when you're hit by an enemy no more than once each second, so 1 charge each time you're hit is really quite nice. Now you can get that as a modifier on Flask prefixes, but you can use a different prefix with a Life Flask if you take this modifier. Now it's not enough necessarily to sustain completely by itself, but it can help a lot in a boss fight and will help give you better Life Flask uptime overall. For 2 points especially is really quite nice. But the Flask Mastery is really good, and you may not be really exploring that if you're not actually playing a Pathfinder or something. There's some very good stuff in here, such as Utility Flask gaining charges passively, Life and Mana Flask gaining charges passively, remove a random elemental element when you use a Mana Flask if you're already using a Mana Flask, worth considering because you can spam Mana Flask quite a bit, use them 5 times quite easily in a row, and remove all elemental ailments. Not as good as complete immunity, but pretty darn good. And then remove a random non-elemental ailment when you use a Life Flask. There's only a couple of those, and most of the time you're only going to be affected by one, so this one's actually very reliable. So instead of having to have staunching and poison removal in other places, you can have them both on your Life Flask with this mastery effectively. Now there's only 2 evasion energy shield masteries on the tree, up here and here. If you're playing a hybrid build, definitely worth paying attention to them, and especially the mastery. The second one from the bottom there is 30% of chaos damage does not bypass energy shield. Now if you're playing a hybrid build that is mostly life, like 5, 6k life and 2 or 3k energy shield, then this one might not be worth worrying about too much. But if you're playing something that's a bit more true hybrid and you've got something like 4k life, 4k energy shield and don't have very good chaos resistance, This can help you avoid a lot of one-shots or a lot of very quick degen deaths by making sure that that chaos damage does not bypass your energy shield, or at least a portion of it. Of course, it's no shavs. You can't really go low life off of this unless you have a ton of chaos resistance, but it certainly can help you bridge that gap. So nice little tool to have in your tool belt. Chaos resistance is good for any build, and tucked away here by a Ghost Dance in a very nice spot, also off the Soul Thief Evasion Energy Shield Mastery there, so located ideally, situated perfectly, is One with Evil, which has a ton of chaos resistance. Spending points on resistances often doesn't seem super attractive, except for like gearing at a budget first league character, but chaos resistance is nearly always good, and you aren't often capping it on gear unless you have quite a large budget, so this one can certainly help. It has a little bit of maximum chaos resist as a boost there as well. The Mastery is also quite good. It's the same as that resistance cluster we looked at earlier. It has things like corrupting blood can't be inflicted on you, so until you get a corrupted jewel that has that, you could take this cluster to pad out your gear in the early to mid game until you can improve your gear a bit. Nice and worth considering. Now, if you're playing a spell slinger, you probably already considered one slinger, but definitely pay attention to how good the Mastery is. The first one is 10% chance to gain a power charge on critical strike with one, so your power charge generation for those spell slinging builds. And then the second one is unnerve enemies on hit, which is enemies take 10% increased spell damage. So very nice stuff there. Unnerve is a bit harder to get these days as well. It's worth noting that the first line there, if you hadn't really kind of paid attention to the wording specifically, is 30% increased damage while wielding a wand rather than damage with wands. So that does affect your spells. It's just a 30% global damage boost while wielding a wand. As long as you're holding one, you get that. You've probably heard, but the lightning clusters are very good. There's a bit of an unfortunate situation where attack builds have a hard time getting this because they're all at the top of the tree, but if you're playing a lightning spellcaster, or if you just so happen to be near the top of the tree, definitely worth taking a look at them. Lightning nodes in general, pretty good stuff, but in particular, that second mastery there, lightning damage with non-critical strikes is lucky. Now, lucky damage is always pretty good. It's usually a few % more damage, somewhere in the range of 4 to 11 on most builds, but it really depends on your damage range. The thing about lightning damage that you may have noticed is that lightning is often something like deal 1 to 1000 damage and has a big range. So lightning damage with non-critical strikes is lucky, is extremely powerful at boosting your average damage by rolling that damage twice and then picking the higher one. With such a high damage range, a big damage boost. Now, this is a little different if you're playing an Archmage build, especially if you're a non-lightning spell using Archmage to gain lightning damage. In that case, your damage range is much closer. So mostly worth using if you're playing an actual lightning skill or using things like Wrath and stuff that give big damage ranges. Here's a cute little tip I got from a viewer, but the Elemental Masteries, one of the most commonly thought about ones over here would be Divine Wrath, Divine Judgment, Divine Fury cluster here. The 1% of elemental damage leached as energy shield is something you might not really think about too much. There's lots of energy shield around, but it is generic global elemental damage leeches energy shield, and this actually works with heralds, which is quite interesting. Herald of Ice, and in particular Herald of Thunder, passively deal a lot of damage, especially Herald of Thunder constantly keeps zapping enemies for a duration even when you're not directly attacking or casting spells, and that will leech with this mastery that damage to your energy shield, giving you a passive energy shield regen or recovery, which is quite nice. So cute little tip there. Back over to the evasion and energy shield masteries once again. I just wanted to talk about the one on the bottom, the +1 to energy shield per 8 evasion on boots. Now you might have thought most boots don't really have much evasion, something like 100, and it's certainly not a stat you're focusing on. All you really care is about getting that movement speed, that life, that sort of things. Or if you're playing an ES build, you probably want actual ES boots with like 150 to 200 ES and 30 move speed. That said, there are some interesting options that make this much more attractive. Two options in particular are Ad Series Step, which has a whopping 740 evasion with 20 quality. In addition to being good boots for hybrid in general, I believe this dodges now spell suppression, but either way, very good boots and give a lot of energy shield with that node. Sin Trek, on the other hand, if you add its already existing energy shield to its high evasion amount, can give you up to 240 energy shield from boots, which is pretty substantial. So there's some options to consider to get a pretty substantial amount of energy shield out of that node on some already pretty decent boots for these sorts of hybrid builds. If you're having trouble getting enough crit chance I wanted to draw some attention to some unconventional locations to get a pretty good amount of crit chance to help bring that score up. The first one is the Spell Suppression Mastery. A defensive cluster mastery is not somewhere you'd expect to get crit chance, but you can get critical strike chances increased by a chance to suppress spell damage. If you're stacking spell suppression, you should really be going for 100, and it's quite achievable, so that's up to 100% increased critical strike chance. Very quite solid. If you're thinking about this on a point-by-point basis, most crit nodes are something like 20 to 30% increased critical strike chance, so that's easily 3 to 4 times that amount. The Lightning Mastery is quite good on the non-crit side of things, but it also gives you a pretty good option to get some crit chance too. 80% increased critical strike chance against shocked enemies. It's actually quite easy for enemies to be shocked, even by a small amount, which means that 80% is pretty consistent. Now, not quite as good, but a pretty unconventional location you may not have thought about is the Blind Mastery, which has 60% increased critical strike chance against blinded enemies, about 2 to 3 passives worth for a single passive. Obviously, these are probably only really worth taking if these are already interesting clusters in your build, but certainly worth noting that here's some options for you to get some extra crit chance. And finally, the Sword Mastery does have something very nice to offer. The third one there is chance to gain Frenzy Charge on when you hit a unique enemy. It can be difficult unless you're willing to use the actual Frenzy skill to hit bosses to gain Frenzy Charges, and this works with range setups and things like that as well that don't necessarily want to get close to the boss. 8% is a lowish sounding amount, but if you're attacking fast, which most sword builds are going to be doing, that is pretty easy to maintain full Frenzy Charges and get a very substantial damage in boss fights. Pretty nice stuff. Overall, the new passive tree has a lot of little secrets and things to discover. Hopefully you guys liked some of these ones that I pointed out today, but if you've discovered some cool things that you've incorporated into your builds, let us know about it in the comments below. I'd love to read some of the cool stuff you found as well, because it's going to take us a while to get familiar with this passive tree, I think. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.